Welcome to Or to Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. There are many themes that reoccur throughout our show, and one of, if not the biggest theme, is this. How do we know? And while this question opens up the door to many philosophical discussions regarding knowledge, epistemology, and ontology, today we're going to follow up on our discussion of verisimilitude by asking the question a different way. How do they know? This simple word substitution suddenly makes the question one of credibility.
Nice.
So, we, after verisimilitude last week, we got, thinking, man, there's more to say there. And there's nothing wrong with doing a verisimilitude part 2. Maybe we will in the future, depending on how long we go, 10 years from now or something. But, so we started throwing around some synonyms. Well, what are some other things that are not synonyms, but, related concepts? And, the one that you
tossed to me and I liked credibility.
Yeah. Credibility. So, and at first blush, again, me just, thinking about what credibility means to me, I thought, okay, well, this is fairly straightforward. As I started doing research, I discovered, no, this is not straightforward at all. Oh. So I think it's going to be fascinating. But what is a credibility?
Well, let's start with the etymology of the word. So credere, to credibilis in Latin, and up through it, it's essentially anchors on the word belief or believe. And that's where the obvious branches off to verisimilitude. But really, you're considering objectivity and you're considering subjectivity, and you're trying to figure out objectively or subjectively. And those two things are vastly different. We know we've talked about these things and we'll continue to. Why is something potentially to be believed? And when we talk about the history of this, we're going back to Aristotle again. We always go back to the big three, right? Because rhetoric at its best was supposed to be about persuading, but persuading toward the truth, seeking the truth. But then we have this branch that also deals with this credibility of a kind called the sophists. And I know we've talked about the sophists. So sophistry is engaging in trying to persuade somebody of anything you want to persuade them about, whether or not it has any basis in truth. So it's persuasion without moral or ethical structure.
Yeah. So that was the really fascinating part. Doing the research was that I think that when most people think of credibility, they just think of the objective part. Like, oh, well, for something to be credible, it has to be right. No, that should be a part of determining credibility, but there is this whole other subjective part of credibility that really influences whether somebody considers that source credible.
Aristotle wanted to know what was persuasive in any particular situation. Where are the elements that persuasion could be brought in to push toward that better outcome, in a sense. Right? And that's why there were these, I call them the three musketeers of ethos. There are three of them anyway, and ethos, logos,
pathos.
The pathos, and the ethical, the logical, and the pathetic. Pathetic meaning relating to the emotions, right? And so if you aim for ethical persuasion and present ethical things you tell a story that's all emotional, and you have factuality built into it, Aristotle said, you've got it made.
Yeah.
Well, no. Patently not, but
I guess it depends on what you mean by having it made. In terms of getting people to believe you're credible, maybe. And that's the interesting thing about credibility is that credibility, I think that in a lot of ways, it's not about objectively about the source of knowledge.
No.
Credibility is about the belief of the person receiving the knowledge.
Is this knowledge believable? That's what. So you can present an absolutely concrete fact. There still are a few, right? But maybe it's wet concrete. But anyway, you aren't necessarily, just by presenting the fact, you haven't established necessarily credibility with the person who's hearing it.
Yeah. So that was the other thing doing the research for the show that struck me. One, was that there's a subjective component to credibility. And the other was that credibility doesn't, it's not focused on the source of information. It's focused on the person receiving the information and how they considered the source credible. So it flips the script sort of from what, at least I don't know if there's others out there that think the same, but at least from what my view was going into it, it flips the script. Oh, the credibility is more about me receiving the information than it is about the person who's giving it.
Right.
So was Aristotle the start of it? Is that where philosophers started being concerned with credibility?
In a formal sense, yes.
Because I wouldn't say the philosophy was always concerned with credibility necessarily, because there was a time, and I think that probably where that would start would be with the birth of science, right? There's probably a time before rigorous inquiry began where it was a lot of postulating, right?
Well, that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is the cauldron for science. So, but yes, there's postulating, yes, and not necessarily toward trying to persuade somebody. Something was more of, here's how the universe works. I'll tell people about it, but really, isn't it interesting? This is how the universe works, but there comes a point at which you want or need people to get on board with the way the universe works, right? And so, we can just jump forward to the climate crisis. And there are still people who do not find it, no matter how many facts are presented, no matter how many tales are told, don't acknowledge that it exists. And more now seem to acknowledge that it exists, but it's just incredible that it could happen because there's nothing that we've done.
Right.
Right. And so, and all of that. And so you think about scientists or with COVID or science going into this battleground, essentially, of saying, look, here's the data. This is what it tells us. And people say, no, that's not credible.
Yeah, and again, this is where credibility gets tricky, right? Because I'm trying to pick my words carefully here. Not science, but the scientific community isn't infallible because it's made up of people. And people have weaknesses, and sometimes the weaknesses are, a cognitive bias or a way of observing things that blinds them to other facts. And sometimes the weakness is a measure of greed or something, a personal gain in exchange for a certain service, right? So there's always going to be scientists, and I'll put that in quotes, that say there is no global warming or there is no climate change. Whether they honestly believe that because they have a certain blindness or they're looking at data a certain way that doesn't jive with the mainstream community and the actual scientific method, or whether they don't necessarily believe the science, but they're being offered something by an oil company or another entity that is interested in continuing business as usual.
And then you look at the big picture, though, and the big picture is almost 98% of scientists on the planet have said and continue to say, this is happening, right? So, all right.
So this is where credibility is interesting, right? Because you might only have that 2% that's doing the wrong thing. But since credibility is on the onus of the audience, of the receivers of the information, it doesn't matter if it's only 2% of scientists saying it doesn't exist. There's a very good chance 50% of the population might cherry pick what those two scientists are saying in order to support their own worldview.
Yep.
And this is something we talked about with verisimilitude last week, and how we come to know information, and that it's important that we start with a process in order to come to a conclusion, rather than starting with a conclusion and then finding evidence that supports that conclusion.
And, yes. And I don't know if this is the moment. You can tell me, hold this thought until it is in what you have planned. But I think we need to talk all about what's the word I want? The trappings, the clothing of, in a metaphorical sense, how information is presented, but then underneath that, how people take the speaker doing the presentation. And this is why this is so much about public speaking. Because we have habituated, trained across huge amounts of time, notions of what makes a speaker credible. Now, there are some pretty standard notions of public speaking, but those have run against, of course, cultural changes and what people are willing to hear because of their very presentation itself. So, as an example, if someone with hesitance begins to say something, or they seem to have a scratchy throat, or their voice isn't deep and women have dealt with this. All genders deal with the perceptions of other genders, but women have dealt with this, for example, when her voice is not low enough, therefore she doesn't have authority. And that kind of stuff gets thrown around all the time by men, right? Because we are blindsided and trained to be so, to only accept a certain timbre of voice as a creditable delivery of information. So anything from body language, kinesthetics, anything with voice quality, which should not have anything to do with, or doesn't, the information itself, but which can render that information not credible because people don't want to think of because of the way it got said.
Yeah, and they've sort of proved this out, showing that the set of qualities you're talking about are usually put under the umbrella term charisma, right? They found charisma and physical attractiveness will determine whether a speaker is considered credible, right? And
your perception of the speaker.
Yeah. So it's less, it's less about what's being said. Two people could say the same thing, but if they're on vastly different ends of the spectrum in terms of their appearance and how they sound and how they present themselves, that's going to determine how the listener considers the information. And you can see this happen all the time. I personally am the type of person that I don't speak confidently because I'm really not, right? If somebody's talking to me about something, I'm going to really listen to what they have to say, and then I'm going to do some mental math here, right? And I'm going to try to integrate that information with what I already know before I come to an opinion and say something. And that thing that I say is probably going to be hesitant because I'm in the process of learning it, right? Those are things that are not valued by a credible source. You want somebody who instantaneously has the answer and, is confident and, makes decisive statements and stuff. But is that
Which
really...
is quite probably why we are in the position we are in today. Because I argue that confidence, the kind of confidence is what's important. It's not from the hip, look at me, I'm able to command anything. Look how many characters we've invented or put on the screen or anywhere else that's like this. But who are the more interesting characters? The ones who run against a wall and realize that they were wrong and that they're wrong again and they better readjust. And yet Captain America is just confident as can possibly be, right? Except when he's not. Except when there's a debate going on about big ideas, I'm staying in pop culture for a second just because I think it's easy to transfer it out to everything else. I think the confidence in knowing that the world is complicated, and thus the confidence in saying this requires thought, and so I am able to confidently say to you that I can be unsure about something, and I might even change my mind about it, but it still needs to be discussed, is a world ahead of the confidence that says, I have all the answers. Only I can solve the problem.
Right. Yeah, it's dangerous. Has the concept of credibility evolved, or has it remained the same over time? Do you think?
It has evolved to some extent. I think evolve is good, because evolve is a good choice of word, because evolution, as we know, is blind, or mostly so. And so things have evolved because, again, of the clash, the essential clash of ethical rhetoric and persuasion with sophistry. And I don't think, for me, even though there would be people much more educated than I with well-earned degrees just would say, oh, no, that rightfully, that there are all kinds of nuances that have taken place, technological nuances. And those are pretty big deal. I think the evolution is in the filters we use to present. But ultimately, I think that either you are making the attempt at persuasion and believability because of the integrity of the data and the import of the moment that is carrying you toward talking about this, or you're somebody who says, yeah, I can sell that. Give me that. I don't have to care anything about it, but I can use my face and sell it. All the logical fallacies that were developed over time or recognized over time, those haven't changed.
Yeah, I think that in doing the reading, they were, there's this sort of things changed with the internet, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Up until that point, a lot of the communication you had was in some fashion seeing these people. But I think that a lot of those things still transfer in technology. If you have a web page, right, you can say whatever kind of nonsense you want on the web page. But if the web page is attractive, right? If the web page states things confidently, it sort of transfers. It's not anthropomorphic, but those qualities that you respect in a speaker, right? The attractiveness and the charisma and these things that give somebody credibility. Yeah. You can transfer those online and to a polished format and establish credibility that way. Whereas, I can say something that's true, right? But if I have a lime green background with red 8-bit letters on the website, people are going to be like, what sort of weird conspiracy theory is this?
Right. And that's exactly that. That's why I said the filters through which it goes. We know now. We know the peril that misuse of social media can create. And the bullying everywhere from the kids who shouldn't be subjected to this, but are, the new horrors of levels of bullying because of the tools and how they're used. But also there is I think it's probably as old as humanity, but I think it's much more easily exacerbated now because of the technology, that you wander to the people that you're going to say what you want them to say. There are all kinds of things that make it much easier to not hear any other thought but the one you just want in the echo chamber.
Yeah, because of the search engine, right? And this is why, a college campus is sort of a magical place, or at least it was. It's been a while since I've been on a real campus, but, because you walk in and there's all of these people from all different walks of life. And, even in the case of, community college, all different age ranges and things.
Yes.
And and everybody's being exposed to new ideas. And then a lot of those people are talking about those ideas with each other. And going in, you don't know what all of these other people believe. So you're either going to hear what they believe, and then you're going to offer a counter, or you're going to state what you believe, and then you're going to come up with other people who have different ideas. On the internet, you can search for something. And the way that you search for something is going to give you different results, right? Depending on if you type in climate change hoax, or or global warming data, or whatever it is, you're going to get a wildly different field of results, and they're going to be tailored to what you're looking for, which that's probably the purpose of a search engine, right? Here we are. We're in an ethical conundrum with our technology that is sort of flies under the radar, right? But it's a big and important part of the credibility discussion.
Yeah, because before that, you could go to let's say the way that I went to college without those tools. And again, I hasten to say this is not nostalgia saying, oh, everything was better back in the old days. It was not. It was onerous. Research was in the sense that you'd have indexes by month, or sometimes by quarter, of all the articles that have been published in a particular field, and the index was guided toward that field. And you'd look up the articles that were published, and you would choose what you wanted to read. But you'd have to look at the title of the article, and even then, it's a scholarly material. You might not be able to suss it out, and you can look at an abstract sometimes. Sometimes you just go for it and go read it. It doesn't say, here's the index of articles that agree with X, or right. No, you had to figure that out. Mm-hmm. And I think that's still very important for critical thinking, to read things you don't necessarily want to read in order to figure out where the field lies and where the credibility problems that you will face in trying to enter into the conversation lie. Now it's a strategy, right? What are people seeming to gravitate toward? And if you're going to talk about that thing, you need to know what they're gravitating toward, so you can then find ethical ways of saying, yeah, but here's the data.
Right. So does the concept of credibility change depending on the context, do you think? Or are we always looking for the same thing across different contexts?
No, I think it changes with the context. If you're talking about, for instance, and you correct me if you're not, if you're talking about sociological things, if you're talking about religious circumstance or a daily news circumstance or a family medicine circumstance, I think that the context of credibility changes. I think that there are different veils that come down and different acceptances depending on those circumstances. But even in the medical circumstance, you know that there are people who accept the medical person that they've found to work with. But there may be people who are working with doctors, who have second languages, third languages, fourth languages, and English is not the first, who thus sound different than the local folk, and therefore, and may speak at a different rate of speed because of cultural normalcy and training. And so all of that may mitigate toward or against accepting the advice. I'm still aware of people who will not go to a female doctor. My God, we're back in the 19th century, but there we are, and therefore, no matter what that doctor says, highly unlikely that the patient was going to the doctor for help will accept the information from said doctor. But if Uncle Fred says it, then maybe they will. So I do think the context changes.
So do you think that, I'm trying to think, are they still looking for the same thing in the different contexts, but maybe they're getting a different mix of the pathos, logos,
and ethos.
Yeah, or do you think it's an entirely different thing whether you're looking for credibility in a journalist or a scientist or an academic or a medical doctor?
Just a lived experience among people, students and people living as a part of our culture. I think that it is. I think, well, what do humans want? They want to hear what they want to hear. They want to hear what's going to make them comfortable. They want to hear what's going to help them feel that they know about the world. They don't want to hear bad news. And when they hear bad news, they want to be able to blame it on the people they want to, and I mean, those are all things that haven't necessarily changed again across the ages, because Aristotle was talking about this kind of stuff in the rhetoric itself. I think the difference is the vast access to reinforcement of what one wants to believe, the rapidity of that access, or in some cases, the absolute non-acceptance. If anything's on the internet, it must be wrong, unless Q says it. Or if anything's on the internet, then it's okay as long as X, Y, or Z. But then academics like me come along and say, okay, there are ways of determining authority of information. And back at the beginning, it was relatively simple. If it's .gov, it's information that's gathered through nonpartisan information sources. But now people hear .gov and say, oh, well, if you don't like the government, then you're not going to accept it. .com is commerce. And therefore, they're trying to sell you something. It may not be a bad thing. It may still have credible, authentic truth to it. But they're trying to sell you something. And so on. And so that not accepting information that doesn't have a name on it, with people with the background of people who've done the research and so on. If it's just a person out there saying something, okay, they have a right to do that, but you probably ought to be careful. That's eroded, ironically, at the very time we have more access to information than we ever did.
Yeah. There's a credibility crisis, for lack of a better term, going on with some of these things, because academics or scientists or these sorts of things, the scientific method, right, hasn't really changed, and academia, in some ways, frustratingly, has not really changed, right? These things continue on the way that they have. They're operating the way that they have for hundreds of years, and are part of the reason that we're here today with men landing on the moon and, no polio and all these other things, right? Academia and science and these things have given us a life of progress that, in 100 years ago, when we couldn't even get planes into the sky, now we have satellites orbiting the Earth telling us exactly our location.
And I'm with you on that, except that those examples you used, each one of them is eroding. We haven't put... If I said, well, we invented cars 50 years ago, and we hadn't invented a new car. Gee, we went all the way to the North Pole 60 years ago. Have we been back? Have we plunged into the ocean further? Polio could come back. All kinds of poxes are coming back. The lack of immunization and inoculation is things are coming back.
Right. And that's because a lack of credibility. And that's the point I was trying to make, is that academia and science, the methods that they use and the accomplishments that they've made have not changed. What's changed is the attitudes of the masses and the perceptions of these things.
Yes, and academia as well, tipping total, just my opinion, as somebody who'd been in the field and the practice for a long time, has the integrity of it has eroded because it has essentially gone to a business model. We'll give you what you want. We won't try to disturb you with ideas you don't want to hear. and we'll just make sure that it's as easy and smooth as it can possibly be, so you don't have to struggle with your education.
Yeah, and I talked about this on the one podcast I was a guest on. It's and again, this really developed about the same time the internet did, and with everything that has sort of exploded along with the internet. Education becoming not everywhere, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, essentially paying for a job certification. And some of those places being influenced by business to the degree that almost, the research, these companies providing grants for research, right? It's all for applied research, right? Attempting to fix a problem rather than original research, right? Because with original research, there's no product at the end of the rainbow necessarily, right? If you just give people money to explore the mysteries of the universe, that money could, in theory, disappear into thin air. Now, has it? No. A lot of great things have come, and the new things come from original research, yes. Right? Applied research fixes problems. So if we don't want to be the kind of people who are still using the same phones and the same internet and all of the same things in the future, but just better versions, then we need to start investing in things that start solving problems that we didn't know we have, or looking at ways of making life better and safer and more healthy for people with technologies that we don't currently have. But there's been a huge shift in the past couple decades away from the original research, which is sort of the spirit of academia.
You have just triggered a thought. You often do, but this is, just now, what just occurred to me is I've often said we used to be, and in no perfect sense, but when we were taking risks in explorational terms, or taking risks with research and development budgets being bigger and so on. That's because we didn't know what was out there, and we were trying to wanting to go figure it out. Now, maybe it was all for capitalistic reasons, because we'll figure out how to make things from it, and we'll make a buck. I'd like to think it was more than that, but okay. But now, the risk taking is in the complacency. Well, I want to take risks and make anything better because things are great as they are. We don't just let's have things as they are. No changes, because we've achieved the ultimate already. So let's have that. And the risk is everything that falls apart because of that. The environment's going to change no matter what we say we see. And diseases will be there if we don't work against them, and will come and get us more. And so the boogeymen are the monsters, so-called. You don't delegitimize them by reducing the credibility of somebody presenting the information. But then that takes us back to the filters again, into but I'm hesitant in what I say.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, if you look at it, it seems pretty obvious that what we're doing is unsustainable. And you might get some pushback on that from people depending on what side of the political aisle they're on. But really, it's a fairly simple philosophical argument to make, and I've made it in the past, right? Mm-hmm. Look at the things that our modern day lives are made out of, and how we produce them and how we go about them. And then ask yourselves if the world has limited resources. And if you understand what things are made out of, and if you agree that the earth isn't an infinite supply of something, then the only logical conclusion is that eventually you'll run out of things, right? Now, that is inevitable. And that raises vastly uncomfortable questions for other people, like, well, how long are we going to let the population continue to grow? Or what are we going to do when we completely run out of resources? And these are questions that need to be considered if the human race is to continue on. But even on a smaller scale, without going that far into the future or that deep into the philosophical pool, you can still ask yourself in the short term, in the immediate term, well, wouldn't it make more sense to start trying to utilize resources that come from things that aren't limited? Trying to derive energy from sunlight or from water or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
There's still problems there, right? Solar panels are still made out of non-renewable resources, right? A hydroelectric dam is still made out of non-renewable resources.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of those components are still recyclable, still reusable, still able to do things. Whereas oil and virgin plastics are not, right? So it's it really doesn't have to come down to politics. It can just come down to a very short chain of rational questions.
Yes.
Which leads to the next question, which is, why do humans accept traits other than accuracy when determining credibility? Why do we do that? Why do we accept the pathos, or the ethos?
Oh, boy, if I just had that wisdom, wouldn't it be nice? Because I'm human, because I've been influenced by many people over the years, and if I think about what influenced me about them, just in teaching terms, I'll just go with something as mundane as teaching. It's really not mundane at all, but the people that I was drawn toward learning more from and listening to were the people who had some presentational dynamism, but it didn't necessarily have to be that which the popular folks in the group would accept, but a discernible, unmeasurable, but discernible authenticity. How's that one for a conundrum, right? Well, wait a minute. How do we get off the slide rule and figure out authenticity?
Right.
And we're presenting information that when one found the legitimacy of it and said, okay, I want to know more. And that's just in teaching. But of course, the affect, AFFECT, how you come off, how you seem, is going to be desperately important to people. And you can't have in the teaching circumstance, there's no such thing as a classroom of students where everyone is going to be equally reached. And the very fact of the affect that is authentic to you is not going to reach some other thing. You make the effort and you can try. But the very nature of presenting and discussing information means that for some people, a certain voice isn't going to work. For other people, it is.
Yeah, and so this is coming back to contextual factors of credibility, but this time, instead of the context being the field we're talking about, the context is the actual presenter of the information.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so again, with humans, this is completely variable, right? Because I've experienced this personally, right? I'm not a people person, so sometimes if I go into a situation and I'm particularly quiet, people tend to think that I'm mean or that I'm scary or something, right? In other situations, if I go into some place and I'm quiet, people automatically think that I'm smart. Say, well, this has happened to me numerous times throughout life. There'll be a group of people having a discussion, right? And I'll just be listening. And I'll say, well, look he's just sitting here listening. Surely he has something important to say, right?
Yes.
And that's a trap that I'll fall prey to as well. Sometimes I'll see people do it and I'll go, you know what, this guy is smart because he's just listening. And then they open their mouth and you go, oh, no, they're not. But You can still be fooled by it even after the fact if the initial impression, right, is that somebody is being laconic. They're sitting there and they're taking everything in and they're processing it. That might not be at all what's happening in their internal life. But just that impression might be enough to give them some credibility when they do speak. Whereas like I said, somebody can be quiet in a different context and maybe being unaware of what your facial features are doing or something. You might think, oh, well, this guy's just, a mean old curmudgeon or, whatever, when really that's not at all the case either.
Right. So many hurdles, so to speak, so many factors. And there are people who spend their lives studying these things. So studying rhetoric, studying facial features, studying the body movements, those kind of things, and studying them across cultures. How close or how far away do you is acceptable? How fast do you talk? All of those lifetimes spent in studying these things because it's so difficult. And then you hope that information is going to reach everybody, but in order to do that, it's got to be presented in a variety of ways by a number of different kinds of people. Excuse me. And this is what occurs to me too about the media that we have and the news cycles that we have. When people hear something more than once, it begins to reinforce if it was based on something they wanted to hear in the first place. If they hear it once in a 24-hour, 48-hour cycle, and they hear lots of other things too, they are less likely to just jump on it and hang on to it. So we've created, again, this Frankenstein's monster, really, of repetition. We know repetition helps us learn things with tools and with a number of other circumstances. We repeat information by the same speakers, more or less, same handful of speakers, depending on your channel or your streaming or your source, over and over and over again. We think that terrible things are happening constantly. Okay, arguably they are. Good things are happening constantly too. But if you see the same shooting, and it's going to be discussed, and it should be, it needs to be, but the discussion often just goes back to, the awfulness of that moment, rather than the implications of it. And it's easy to dwell on that as a syncretic, isolatable moment, but it's certainly not going to affect all of us. But we're finding out that it does.
Yeah, and there's even a component of it that makes you ask, is by focusing on that particular moment, are we adding fuel for future people who might commit some of these acts, right? Some sort of notoriety or some sort of moment, 15 minutes of fame, in a macabre kind of way, rather than focusing on how to prevent this sort of thing in the future. Yeah, it's, and again, how we're determining this credibility. You said one that stuck out to me, right? There's researchers that put a lot of effort into trying to determine what sort of things people would consider credible, but that's going to vary from person to person, right? The one that you brought up was how close somebody speaks, right? Mm-hmm. Again, I'm not a people person, so I'm always keeping a very large distance between me and other people when I'm talking with them, which isn't even that often, right? I've had contact with lots of people throughout life who speak very close. And then even if I back up, they will walk in again, right?
Yes.
Now, what they're saying might be credible, but my brain, the only thing that it can tell me is, man, why are they so close? Oh man, I don't like this.
Danger, yeah. Right. Yeah.
And so the message goes out the window. Whereas if they are in contact with another close talker, those two people might have a very good exchange of information, and they might both consider each other very credible, right? So there's even that individual factor. So, again, with credibility being on the individual receiving the information,
right?
Not only are there factors of the speaker, like charisma and attractiveness and trustworthiness and expertise that matter in credibility. But there's also the individual subjective biases of the one receiving the information, that some of them are probably unchangeable, right? I don't think I will ever be a close talker. And so as a result, even if somebody is a trustworthy expert, and they're attractive and charismatic, if they're 6 inches from my face, there's a very good chance I'm just going to have a hard time hearing what they're actually trying to say. And
you have the advantage of knowing that, and therefore, possibly with you, probably when you step back, trying to piece together what the person was saying and being able to analyze your way through the thicket of your legitimate needs as a receiver. That's the lots of people aren't going to go that far. And so the message is going to...
Yeah, and it's not necessarily... they're not going to go that far, not on purpose. It's not like they're trying to discard what's being said, but it's just that a lot of us are unaware of these internal biases we do have. Mm-hmm. And so if you're unaware of them, and especially unaware of how powerfully they affect your ability to receive information, then there's a whole lot of information you're going to throw out just because it's not reaching you in the right way.
I'm going to go to a side note now and take that opportunity to say, even though I'm not formally a teacher anymore, that this is why one takes classes, is forced in some programs still, to some extent, to take things that you normally wouldn't take. Some programs require public speaking. And I don't want to public speak. I'm not interested in it. Okay, well, yes, I get it. I totally get it. Taught public speaking for decades. Yes, I understand. I'm not particularly comfortable in gigantic crowds of people all trying to talk at the same time either. Mm-hmm. And so we put up our shields and we adjust and all. But if you don't engage in studying public speaking and trying to practice it, then you may well not learn how to be more attentive to how information is being presented. Well, I don't want to do that. I just want to go out and okay, yes, but still, you're going to go out and be able to apply your trade, your craft, your profession better if you understand how people are communicating with each other.
Yeah. I know that we've talked about it, but this podcast has really been the greatest classroom for me in terms of public speaking, because I'm not a people person. And on top of not being a people person, I consider myself a pretty slow information processor. And that's the way it's always been, whether I'm studying for school or learning a new job or something. I do not consider myself a quick learner, which is something that's very highly valued by society. It takes me a minute to get stuff, but then once I have it, I have it, But I remember, people might not know this, but we were talking about it before the show. Just podcasting is a form of public speaking, right? Mm-hmm. We're not speaking live, but we have the knowledge that this is going to be live and that there's going to be hundreds or thousands of people that listen to it. And so going into it, you still have all of those same pressures that you have doing regular public speaking. And, I remember I took public speaking with you years and years ago. And I remember thinking the same thing at the time, right? The same thing that everybody thinks. When am I ever going to use public speaking, right? And especially being somebody who is just naturally quiet. When would I ever be speaking to a group? And now I speak to a group on the podcast. I'm also in charge of a whole factory of people that I have to talk to. And, I've been in bands that have played in front of hundreds of people. And so I've spent my whole life speaking in front of groups, right?
Yes.
And, having that ability, this is something that's definitely evolved throughout time. And I'm sure that there's plenty of people that listen and think, well, this guy still can't publicly speak. Listen to all the ums and the ands and all this stuff. And they're right, but it's a work in progress, right? When I first started, just hearing you say something, and then I just have this moment of panic, right? Oh man, like what am I going to say back? Like should I ask a question? Should I comment on it? Should I do this sort of thing? And there were some sort of dead awkward spaces. If you've been listening to us from the beginning, you'll pick up on them, right? But as time has gone on, these skills develop, right? And the ability to quickly be able to hear what somebody's saying and analyze, and integrate it with, synthesize it and do all of these things, and then make the decision to move on to another question or to comment on it and do these things, it develops. And so I think that is an important part of credibility that isn't really explored.
It's a fantastic point you made, because it is a development. It is a sensing of rhythm. This is what rhetoric and communication is about, rhythm. Thinking about whether one's going to say, lots of my students know that I was counting ums every time they were done, not to embarrass anybody, but just to say, okay, here are the hash marks. Maybe a goal would be to cut that in by a third the next time. And then inevitably, invariably, people sooner or later will default to it. I do. Sometimes I do more on this than I do when I'm talking in other public circumstances. I think it's because of the concern about dead space. Well, it's the machines, right? It's a lovely circular microphone in front of me that does not dominate the space. I can see my conversation mate. But still, one is aware. Until that point when one isn't worried about it going out over it's just the conversation. And conversation takes practice. And at the beginning, we certainly had conversed before, but we didn't have the practice of finding the rhythms and when is it dead space and when is it thought.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why we did. I think both of us were determining that this, one of the many reasons for this, other than the sheer joy of it, is to model roughly, imperfectly, the regular conversation that is so important to a developing culture, a developing mind for life.
And that's where the struggle with credibility comes in, right? Is because in attempting to model the conversation, we're also attempting to set a good example for philosophical thought and process. And part of philosophical thought and process is not speaking too quickly and not assuming you have all of the answers and not doing all of those things. Mm-hmm. And part of podcasting is diametrically opposed to that, right? It's making sure there's no dead space and making sure that you have information to pass on and that sort of stuff. So I'm sure that there's plenty of listeners that listen to us day in and day out and go, these guys are just a bunch of idiots that think they have all the answers and are just going on and on. And then there's probably other people that go, you want to know what? These guys, they might put a little bit too much thought into stuff and not really commit to anything as much as they should. And, so I think it's probably spread all over the place, depending on how those individual listeners at home establish credibility listening to us. Is it the logic of the arguments? Is it the emotions that we appeal to? Is it the characteristics of our voices, of the cadence of our speeches, of the dead space? So all of those same rhetoric and credibility issues are happening right here in the podcast, and people respond to them in vastly different ways, as we've seen through reviews and through other things.
Yes.
So why do humans hold beliefs that have been discredited?
Oh, you are full of marvelous questions today. You are anyway, but these are. I'm not going to stand here and pretend to answer that. Well, I'm sitting, so I just lost my credibility. If I had any, I'm going to ask a question in return. Aren't we a species, human beings, who just want to be sure that what we know is what we know. And what we knew was what we knew before something actually became known. So we didn't know it. We just convinced ourselves we knew it. And we are marvelous creatures sometimes. We are brilliant creatures sometimes. We are incredibly creative creatures sometimes. This human being thing that all of us are collectively, but we are also intransigent. We are arrogant. We are bullheaded and bullish and bullying and unwilling to encounter the new because it's just too uncomfortable. And the grand thing is that we are all of those things mixed up together. Because if we were just the latter, we wouldn't exist anymore.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm getting excited for the James Webb Space Telescope. I was convinced that it was going to blow up on the pad.
When we were on our pins and needles watching the thing.
Because after, so many delays and so much money spent, I was like, there's no way this thing's going to work, right? Well, now it's looking like it's actually going to work. Yeah. And it's going to reveal mysteries of the universe, especially at the beginning of time, that's probably going to alter our whole scientific paradigm. And I think that that's uncomfortable, right? Because this has happened several times, even in my short lifetime, right? Where you have something that is a scientific fact, in quotes, right? About the age of the universe or dark energy or all of these different things, how they work and whatnot. And there is something about it that when you are taught the fact or you research the fact or whatever, you take some comfort or some pride in knowing it and passing it on to others. And then science, the process continues to march on. And we talked about this last week with verisimilitude, where science isn't about proving anything, right? There are no facts in science. All you're doing is disproving things that don't exist. And that's the question of verisimilitude is, well, if our current knowledge, if we know based on our entire history of knowledge that what we know now is not actually correct, but it's just a working theory that's been honed and developed from things that we knew were wrong. When the new thing pops up and you're confronted with this contrasting knowledge, I think there's a part of your mind that says, but I spent all this cognitive time and effort on learning this fact and integrating it into my worldview and making it a part of me. And now you're telling me I have to change my whole paradigm, And whether or not that's a conscious or unconscious thought, it creates cognitive dissonance. It creates something in you that says, well, now you have a choice, right? Yeah. You can continue with the thing that's comfortable and the thing that you know, in quotations, and continue as business as usual. Or you have to do the hard work of relearning something new and then synthesizing that with all of the information and worldview that you had before, and really doing the hard work of sorting through and saying, well, what makes sense and what doesn't anymore, and throwing it out, with the full knowledge that you're going to have to do it again and again and again and again. And it's hard work, right?
It is.
It'd be like if you had to go through your whole house every couple of years and say, oh, well, this thing doesn't work anymore. And, we know.
It is very hard work, but also it yields without promise of or certainty. It seems to have the ability to yield liveliness and flexibility into the aging process. Whereas just repeating the same old things as they were without acknowledging anything new seems to have a deleterious effect in the aging process. So you could reduce it all to, well, what's better for me? To eat my spinach and to learn new things. Or to go the other route.
Yeah. And I think that, the more you do it, the easier it gets, until you become somebody like us, where that's sort of the thrill of life is now the thrill of it is the unknown, right? And so we come into these conversations and we go full out saying, yeah, we don't know anything and we're not going to give you any answers. Here, we're just going to explore a bunch of stuff we don't know about. And that's frustrating.
Well, sure. But it also tends to teach us new things and leads us to read new things and think freshly. My last word on credibility today, it's not the last word of credible, is the situation that many people are writing about now that happened very, very recently when a person working for Google, a Google researcher, declared that the artificial intelligence program in development that he was conversing with has become human. And that sent ripples through everyone. So the industry trashing him, he's out of Google, he's out, but people were saying, no, this is the kind of voice we need in considering the ethics of artificial intelligence, because what he is saying is, how are we going to confront this when it happens? But for me, the interesting thing is that it was sourced in credibility. There was a moment in the conversation between that human being and that algorithmically complex AI in development. There was a moment of credibility that became more than just a moment of credibility for that researcher to say it has happened. And even if it didn't, and most of the folks in the field are saying, no, we're not anywhere near that yet. Even if it didn't happen for him, there was that moment of credibility. And so the questions need to be asked. What happens when it wakes up?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it is important. And it's important because it raises questions that we don't think about much, right? Another good one is, we'll all admit that our pets have personalities, but none of us are going to admit that our pets are persons, right? Mm-hmm. So the way that we use language and the way that we conceptualize some of these abstract concepts and the consequences that it can have on how we interact with different things is vitally important. So whether or not it happened in a given context, the possibility of it occurring,
or the probability,
the probability of it occurring, are things that we should consider before we run up against it.
Yes.
And I think that is a big part of credibility. So yeah, man, this is a good discussion. I'm really glad that we decided to follow up on verisimilitude.
Me too.
And there was a bunch of other ones that I threw at you that were similar to it. And I don't know if we'll go right into them. Maybe we'll give you a break and go on to something else. But a lot of them were very interesting, and I'm sure that we're going to be following up on this concept in the future. So until next time, keep on.